All right, welcome back. So we're going to now look at how do we control our breathing, and really, most of this is not necessarily how we voluntarily control it, but what is the nervous system input for controlling our breathing, right? And so, as we mentioned in a previous part, this is controlled under the autonomic nervous system, right, at a baseline. So the respiratory center in our brainstem and our medulla, we've got two kind of main groups, one called a ventral respiratory group and a dorsal respiratory group, right? So the ventral group, as we'll see, is kind of responsible for kind of initiating and generating the rhythm. And then the dorsal group will integrate various information from chemoreceptors, from mechanoreceptors in the periphery, and then relay that information to the ventral group, and then our respiratory output will be modified, right? And you then have what's called the pontine respiratory group in the pons, and this is influencing the medullary respiratory group, right? So it's affecting the action of the medulla oblongata, right? So the kind of upper motor neurons, right, in that ventral respiratory group, those are what are initiating the signal. And then we have a peripheral spinal nerve that actually extends out to our muscles that cause them to contract, right? So for our intercostals, it's the intercostal nerves, right? The intercostal nerves are just the ventral rami of thoracic spinal nerves. And then to our diaphragm, it's the phrenic nerve, right? So remember, phrenic nerve is it's going down to the diaphragm, which is kind of the separation between our thoracic and abdominal cavities. But the phrenic nerve itself is coming from the high cervical region, right? So it's coming from cervical regions or levels 3, 4, and 5. Okay. So the way you can remember this is C3, 4, and 5 keeps the diaphragm alive, right? C3, 4, 5, phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. So this is why, high cervical spinal cord injuries, right? Car accidents, athletic event injuries, things like that. High cervical spinal cord injuries that are in that level C3, 4, and 5 and above have the ability to affect spontaneous ventilation. So affect your ability to breathe independently, right? So our respiratory rate and our respiratory activity is also influenced by things like chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors that we'll talk about later. So chemoreceptors, these are detecting changes in chemicals, right? So hydrogen ions, carbon dioxide, oxygen, right? Or the partial pressures of those, right? So we have some of these chemoreceptors in regions of blood vessels, right? So as blood flows through those regions, they're detected by what's called the aortic and carotid bodies. The aortic body is part of the in the arch of the aorta, and our carotid body is kind of right at the bifurcation of our common carotid artery into an internal and an external carotid, right? But these are stimulated by changes in our gases, right? And so you can think that if you have a change in carbon dioxide levels, right? So say you have an increase in CO2 in the blood, right? Well, that probably implies that you're not exhaling enough CO2. So this would be picked up by one of our cranial nerves, so either glossopharyngeal or vagus, depending on which chemoreceptor it's coming from. And then this chemical stimulus, right, the increase in CO2, is then going to be relayed to that respiratory center in the medulla, and then the output will be to modify respiratory activity to accommodate for the change in the chemicals, right? So you can think of it in this graphic way, right? So you've got increased blood CO2, whether it's coming from the carotid body or the aortic body, that is going to the brainstem, and then that information is being relayed right into our medullary respiratory center, and then you get an output to our muscles of breathing. So stimulate the diaphragm, stimulate the external intercostals to contract further, so to increase respiratory rate, to exhale and blow off that additional CO2, right? So all of this blue here is our sensory inputs, right? So things coming into the nervous system, and then all the red are outputs going to muscles, right? So stimulating motor activity. Okay. So again, main thing here is as you are changing the chemical composition of the blood, the respiratory rate is going to increase or decrease, right? So again, think of this in the context of maybe like holding your breath, right? If you hold your breath, you build up CO2, right? And then as soon as you exhale, right, as soon as you stop holding your breath, your respiratory rate for a brief period of time is kind of heightened, right? It's elevated in an effort to blow off all that excess CO2 and bring in oxygen because your oxygen levels were low at the same time your CO2 levels were high, right? So again, these various groups, as we mentioned earlier, the ventral respiratory group, that's kind of initiating the stimulus for breathing. Whenever we exhale, again, we said that's largely a passive process, so you basically just inhibit that ventral respiratory group. Whenever you are exhaling, no signals going down to the phrenic nerve is not innervating the diaphragm relax, intercostal muscles also relax. Okay. Whenever you have a normal respiratory rate, so again, this is for quiet breathing, right? So eupnea, the normal is usually somewhere between 12, 15, 12 to 16, okay? The pontine respiratory group, as we mentioned earlier, it's kind of receiving input and it's coordinating the activity of both the ventral and dorsal respiratory groups, right? So again, it's receiving input and modifying that activity as appropriate. So if you damage this region, that then regulates and controls the medullary respiratory center, then you can end up with erratic breathing, abnormal breathing, maybe too shallow, maybe too deep, things like that. Okay. So one clinical kind of context we can look at with relation to breathing is apnea, right? So you've heard of sleep apnea, likely, and this is the absence of breathing during kind of a period of time during, if it's specifically sleep apnea, it's a particular time during sleep, right? So apnea in general is just not breathing, and this occurs whenever we swallow or hold our breath, right? So if you think about the act of swallowing, right? So to breathe, your larynx has to be open, right? The glottis has to be open. The epiglottis is, open. It's not covering the glottis, and the air is moving, right? But whenever you swallow something, right, that epiglottis folds down, it covers the opening to the glottis, it closes off the trachea and the larynx, right? So no air is flowing, right? So in that case, when you swallow, you're not breathing, right? Sleep apnea is that same thing, but abnormal whenever you are sleeping, right? So temporary cessation of breathing during sleep. So the way this is treated is with something called a CPAP machine, right? Continuous positive airway pressure. And so what this does is that during instances of breathing during sleep, there is pressure that is pushed. There's air that is continually pushed into the airway to aid in keeping the airway patent and open such that you don't stop breathing while you are sleeping. Okay. Now, there are various reflexes that are going to control our breathing process. So again, we already kind of talked about our chemoreceptors, right? So changes in CO2, changes in oxygen, right? That are going to stimulate and trigger changes in those medullary respiratory groups that are then going to go out to our diaphragm, to our intercostals, and stimulate those muscles to contract, right? So again, peripheral and central chemoreceptors changing or monitoring changes in blood hydrogen, CO2, oxygen, and then relaying that signal to the medulla, and then the medulla out to the muscles, right? So affecting breathing. So the main stimulus is blood carbon dioxide levels, right? So again, think holding your breath, increasing CO2, decreasing CO2. Now, we'll talk about this more whenever we do things like kidney, and we talked about it a little bit, I think, whenever we did our blood lecture. But CO2 will not always circulate just in the form of CO2, but it will circulate in the form, or it can circulate in the form of hydrogen whenever it combines with water. So it combines with water, forms carbonic acid, which is H2CO3, and then H2CO3 or carbonic acid can dissociate and form hydrogen ions, right? So again, this is the CO2. Essentially, think of it as like an acid, right? It promotes it contributes to the formation of hydrogen ions, right? So you can end up with changes in pH that are then going to stimulate, respiratory centers to further stimulate the diaphragm, intercostals to change the rate of breathing. Right now, oxygen itself, as it fluctuates, is not significantly going to alter our drive to breathe. Right, that is primarily with CO2. Okay, now you can have instances in which individuals develop a hypoxic drive to breathe rather than an increased level of CO2, right? And so this is occurring in patients who have things like COPD, right? So chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, in which essentially their bodies adapt to having continuous increased levels of CO2, so of carbon dioxide. They end up with something called kind of air trapping, where essentially they retain more CO2 than normal, and their body accommodates, and it becomes used to this increased level of CO2, and so they stop responding as much to major changes in CO2. So instead, their body switches to what's called a hypoxic drive, and in this case, the PO2, the partial pressure of oxygen, is now what is stimulating their drive to breathe. So something important that can happen is if you have a patient who now has this hypoxic drive and you administer oxygen, right? You administer elevated levels of oxygen, maybe in a clinical setting, this can actually knock out their drive to breathe, because now their drive to breathe is oxygen, low levels of oxygen, rather than higher levels of CO2. Okay. So you have to be kind of conscious and aware of that in patients who have COPD, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, things like that. Right. So again, with this whole process of breathing, part of it is autonomic, if you will. Part of it is conscious. Right. So a lot of it is autonomic. Right. You don't. Most of the time throughout the day, you're not thinking about breathing. Right. You're thinking about breathing now because we're talking about it, right? But here in a little bit, whenever you go off and you do something else, you won't be thinking about breathing, right? But we can override that and consciously, choose to stimulate or not stimulate certain muscles. So in that case, it's conscious, right? So there's both kind of an autonomic component and a conscious component as well, right? So let's stop here for this part. We'll pick up on our next part, beginning to talk about airflow and how that's influenced by things like pressure gradients and resistance in our airways.